Welcome to the Grayson Legacy, Shadows of Justice. A small town, an unassuming grandmother, and a secret so dangerous it could unravel the highest levels of power. What would you do if the truth came at the ultimate cost? In this gripping tale of corruption, sacrifice, and unshakable resolve, Helen Grayson stands at the center of a storm she's kept hidden for decades. But when her enemies come knocking, she must decide: protect her family or expose the secrets that could destroy them all. Stay with me, because the twist you're about to uncover will leave you questioning everything. Are you ready to dive into the shadows? The silence in Plain Rock was almost a character of its own. Empty streets, rusted swings in the park, and the occasional toll of the church bell painted a picture of a town where time had stopped. Helen Grayson sat on the porch of her small house, watching the deserted road with a cup of tea in her hands. At 90 years old, Helen was a symbol of resilience. A World War II veteran, her steady hands and sharp eyes concealed stories she rarely shared. Her days passed slowly, punctuated by routine visits to the local diner, where she always sat at the same table by the window. That afternoon, the smell of fresh coffee mixed with grease from the griddle. The few patrons inside spoke in murmurs, but the atmosphere shifted abruptly. The rumble of engines echoed outside, growing louder as it approached the diner. Conversation stopped, and everyone turned toward the windows. Helen looked up. Through the glass, she saw 3 gleaming motorcycles roll to a stop. Their riders, muscular men clad in leather, dismounted slowly, their presence commanding attention. As they stepped inside, the door chime seemed louder than usual. The largest of the men, with cold, calculating eyes, led the group with an intimidating presence. His gaze swept across the room before landing on Helen, who didn't flinch. The air felt heavy. The quiet of Plain Rock had been broken, and it wouldn't be easily restored. The heavy footsteps of the bikers echoed on the diner's wooden floor. The leader of the group, known as Reaper, walked up to the counter, ordering a cup of coffee in a voice laced with menace. "We're looking for someone," he said casually, his eyes scanning the room until they settled on Helen. Sitting at her usual table, Helen remained composed. She lifted her cup of tea with steady hands, but her sharp eyes revealed she was on high alert. "Ma'am," Reaper began, taking a few steps toward her table, "I hear you're full of stories and memories." "Anyone who knows me knows I'm full of memories," Helen replied, a faint smile curving her lips. Reaper chuckled darkly. "Smart lady, huh? Let's cut to the chase. We know you're holding on to something that doesn't belong to you." The diner fell even quieter, if that was possible. All eyes were fixed on the exchange. Helen gently placed her teacup on the table and met Reaper's gaze with a calmness that seemed to unnerve him. "I hold on to a lot of things, son. Some memories, some keepsakes. But I think you've got the wrong person." The tension in the air was almost tangible. Reaper stepped back, but not before pointing a finger at Helen. "This isn't a request, lady. I'll be back tomorrow to collect what we're after. It'd be smart if you cooperated." Helen watched him walk out, followed by his men. The sound of the motorcycles faded into the distance, but the threat Reaper left behind hung in the air like a shadow. Helen knew the piece of Plain Rock was over, and she'd need all her strength and some unlikely allies for what was coming next. Helen sat at her kitchen table, the house eerily quiet. Outside, the fading sunlight cast long shadows over her small yard. She stared at the black rotary phone on the counter, her mind racing. Reaper's words echoed in her ears. She reached for the phone with steady hands, despite the turmoil inside her. The click of each dialed number felt deliberate, a countdown to a decision she didn't make lightly. After a few rings, a gruff voice answered. "Raymond," Helen said, her voice calm but firm. "Mom!" The man on the other end sounded both surprised and cautious. "I need your help," she said, wasting no time. "It's serious." A long silence followed. Helen could picture Raymond on the other side, processing her words. She hadn't spoken to her son in years. Their relationship had been strained for as long as she could remember, a mix of pride and anger keeping them apart. "What kind of trouble are you in?" Raymond finally asked. "It's not about me," Helen replied. "It's about something I've been keeping, something people want. Dangerous people." Raymond let out a slow breath. "You're telling me this now? After all this time?" "I wouldn't call if it weren't important," she said. "Will you come?" Raymond paused, then sighed. "I'll be there by morning." Helen hung up the phone, her hand trembling slightly. She sat back in her chair, staring at the clock ticking on the wall. She'd opened a door she could never close. The next morning, Jack Grayson arrived at Helen's house, his ties slightly loosened after driving down from Dallas. His grandmother had called him earlier, but her voice had been vague, refusing to explain much over the phone. As Jack entered the house, he found Helen sitting in her armchair, a distant look in her eyes. "Grandma, what's going on? You sounded off last night." Before Helen could respond, the sound of engines filled the air. Jack turned to the window just as a convoy of sleek black SUVs rolled down the dirt road and stopped in front of the house. "What the hell?" Jack muttered, stepping onto the porch. From the lead SUV, a man in a tailored suit and sunglasses stepped out. His presence was magnetic, but there was a sharpness in his movements. "Raymond," Jack said, his voice incredulous. Raymond grinned, taking off his sunglasses. "Hey, little brother. Long time no see." Jack clenched his fists, his face tightening. "What are you doing here?" Helen stepped out onto the porch, her tone steady but commanding. "I called him." Jack's jaw dropped. "You called him? The man who runs God knows how many illegal operations? What are you thinking, Grandma?" "I'm thinking about surviving," Helen said. "And right now I need him." Raymond's smile faded. "You didn't call me to fight with him, did you, Mom? What's the problem?" Helen gestured for both men to come inside. "I'll explain everything. But for now, Raymond, we need your help. Jack, I need your understanding." Jack crossed his arms, but followed her back into the house. Tension filled the air, thick and unyielding, as the fractured family prepared for what lay ahead. The tension in Helen's house was palpable. Jack stood by the kitchen counter, his arms crossed, watching Raymond like a hawk. Raymond, in his tailored suit and polished shoes, seemed out of place in the modest home. Yet he carried himself as though he owned it. Helen placed a kettle on the stove, the whistle of boiling water breaking the silence. "Sit down, both of you," she said firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. Raymond smirked as he slid into a chair, but Jack remained standing, his posture rigid. "You haven't explained why he's here, Grandma," Jack said. Helen poured herself a cup of tea before turning to face them. "Yesterday, some men came to the diner. Bikers. They're part of a gang called the Vipers. They're looking for something I've been keeping." Jack's brow furrowed. "What could they possibly want from you?" Raymond leaned back, his arms draped over the chair. "I think I know the answer." He looked at Helen. "This is about the documents, isn't it?" Helen's eyes met his, and for a moment, the years of distance between them melted away. "Yes, it's about the documents." "What documents?" Jack demanded. Helen sighed, sitting at the table. "After the war, I came across evidence of corruption. Powerful people, politicians, businessmen, even law enforcement. I thought it was buried for good, but now they've found me." Jack stared at her in disbelief. "You've been hiding this for decades." Raymond shrugged. "That explains why you always told me to be careful who I trusted." He leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Mom, if the Vipers are involved, this goes deep. They're not just here to talk." Helen nodded. "That's why I called you, and it's why I need both of you to work together." Jack shook his head, still processing. "This is insane." Raymond grinned. "Welcome to the family business, little brother." Later that evening, Helen pulled out a worn metal box from beneath her bed. Jack and Raymond watched as she carefully unlocked it, revealing folders, yellowed papers, and photographs. "These," she said, placing the documents on the dining table, "are what they're after." Jack picked up one of the folders, his eyes scanning the faded typewritten pages. Names, dates, and amounts of money were meticulously recorded. This is evidence of bribery, money laundering, and embezzlement. These names, some of them are still in power today. Helen nodded, and they'll do anything to keep it quiet. Raymond flipped through a stack of photographs. Some showed men in suits shaking hands. Others depicted clandestine meetings in shadowy rooms. "You kept all of this?" "Why?" "Because knowledge is power," Helen said firmly. "As long as I have this, they can't erase me." Jack slammed a folder shut. "This doesn't feel like power. This feels like a target on your back." "It's both," Helen admitted. "But I couldn't destroy it. Too many people suffered because of these men. Someone has to hold them accountable." Raymond studied his mother. "You're braver than most soldiers I knew. But if you think they'll back off, you're wrong. They'll come back, and they'll bring more than words." "That's why I need you," Helen said. "I can't run, and I won't hide. We have to fight back." Jack looked at her, frustration mingling with admiration. "You're asking us to take on a gang and a network of corruption that's bigger than anything we can imagine." Helen placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm asking you to stand with me. Together, we can do this." Raymond smirked. "Guess we're in for one hell of a fight." Emily Harper tapped her pen against her notebook, her eyes fixed on the photograph in front of her. The journalist had been following whispers about corruption in Texas for years, but now things were starting to take shape. The Viper's sudden presence in Plain Rock wasn't random. Her editor had warned her not to dig too deep, but that wasn't Emily's style. She'd heard about Helen Grayson, the Quiet War veteran, and the recent arrival of Raymond King Grayson, a name that sent shivers through law enforcement circles. Emily adjusted her glasses and stood, grabbing her camera. She had tracked the Vipers to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. Parking her car a safe distance away, she crept through the brush, snapping pictures of the motorcycles lined up outside. She crouched behind a dumpster, listening as two bikers talked by the door. "Reaper's mad as hell," one said, lighting a cigarette. "The old lady's got something big." "Bigger than we thought," the other replied. "Boss says if we don't get those documents, it's our heads." Emily's pulse quickened. She snapped a few more photos before retreating to her car. If she was right, Helen's documents could expose a web of corruption that reached far beyond Plain Rock. Back at her motel, Emily sorted through her notes and photos. She hesitated, staring at Helen's address scrawled on a piece of paper. She needed answers. Grabbing her coat, she headed out. As she drove, one thought lingered. This story could make her career or end it. Reaper paced the floor of the warehouse, his boots echoing against the concrete. His men stood around him, silent and tense. The air smelled of motor oil and cigarettes. "She's stalling," Reaper growled, slamming a fist onto a table. "That old lady thinks she's smarter than me. She's got connections." One of the bikers said that Raymond Grayson showed up. "Word is he's dangerous." Reaper laughed coldly. "Dangerous? He's a crook like the rest of us. The difference is I'm not afraid of him." He leaned over the table, where a map of Plain Rock was spread out. Reaper's finger traced a path to Helen's house. "She's sitting on a gold mine, and I don't care how old she is. Tomorrow, we're going to her doorstep, and if she doesn't hand over what we want, we'll make an example of her." The men nodded, their expressions grim. Outside, the roar of an approaching motorcycle broke the tension. A young biker, barely out of his teens, rushed in. "Boss, we've got a problem. Someone's been snooping around. A woman, taking pictures." Reaper's eyes narrowed. "Who?" "Don't know her name, but she's been asking about you and the documents." Reaper's jaw tightened. "Find her. I don't need reporters sniffing around." He grabbed a shotgun leaning against the wall. "Tomorrow, we end this. That old woman won't know what hit her. Helen stood at the head of the table, her weathered hands resting on the wood as she looked at her son and grandson. Raymond sat back in his chair, casual but attentive, while Jack leaned forward, his arms crossed and his face tense. "We don't have time for arguments," Helen said firmly. "The Vipers will come back. They're not the real threat. They're just a muscle. The people behind them are the ones who will stop at nothing to silence us." Jack shook his head. "I don't understand why you kept this to yourself all these years. These documents could have gone to the authorities decades ago. And who would have listened?" Helen countered. "You think the system would have protected me? These men own the system." Raymond nodded. "She's not wrong. Trusting the wrong person with this would have gotten her killed." Jack shot him a glare. "And what's your plan, Raymond?" "Sell the documents to the highest bidder." Raymond's jaw tightened. "I'm not here to sell anything. I'm here because Mom asked me to be. Don't mistake my help for ambition." Helen raised a hand, silencing them both. "This isn't about personal gain or blame. It's about survival. We need to focus on protecting the documents and each other." Jack exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "So, what's the plan?" "We hold our ground," Helen said. "We stay vigilant, and when the time is right, we expose the truth." Raymond smirked. "Sounds simple enough." Helen's gaze hardened. "It's not simple, and it won't be easy, but it's the only way." Emily parked her car a block away from Helen's house, her heart pounding. She'd been watching the Grayson home for the past hour, debating whether to approach. The story was getting bigger than she anticipated, and she needed answers. The sound of engines in the distance drew her attention. Emily ducked in her seat as two motorcycles roared past. Their headlights briefly illuminated Helen's house before disappearing down the road. Emily grabbed her camera and stepped out of the car. She approached the house cautiously, the gravel crunching under her boots. Just as she reached the porch, the door swung open and Raymond stepped out, his sharp eyes locking onto her. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone clipped. Emily raised her hands, her camera dangling from her neck. "I'm a journalist. Emily Harper. I've been following the Vipers, and I think—" Raymond cut her off. "You think what? That you can just walk into this and play hero? You've got no idea what's at stake." "I know more than you think," Emily shot back. "I know the Vipers are working for someone powerful, and I know they're after something Helen has. If you don't let me help, people could die." Helen appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "She's not wrong, Raymond." Raymond glanced back at his mother, then at Emily. "And what exactly can you do to help?" Emily squared her shoulders. "I can document everything. Expose the truth. Isn't that the point?" Helen nodded slowly. "Come inside, Miss Harper. But understand this. Once you're in, there's no going back." Emily hesitated, then stepped through the door. The warmth of the house contrasted with the chill of the night, but the tension inside was unmistakable. Raymond closed the door behind her. "Hope you're ready for what you just signed up for." The night was still and cold, with a heavy fog settling over Plain Rock. Inside Helen's house, the air was tense. Jack sat at the dining table, flipping through the incriminating documents. Emily was in the corner, typing notes into her laptop, while Raymond stood by the window, his sharp eyes scanning the dark street outside. "They're watching," Raymond muttered, pulling the curtain back slightly. "I've dealt with men like this before. They won't wait long." Helen nodded from her chair. "We stay ready." Suddenly, the faint rumble of motorcycles broke the silence. Jack looked up, his face pale. "They're coming." The roar grew louder until headlights pierced the darkness. Two motorcycles screeched to a stop in front of the house. The riders dismounted, one pulling out a crowbar while the other carried a bat. "They're testing us," Raymond said, grabbing a pistol from the table. "Let's show them we're not easy targets." Helen stood, her expression calm but commanding. "No bloodshed, unless it's necessary. We don't want this escalating further than it already has." Raymond gave a tight nod. "Got it." The bikers started pounding on the door, shouting threats. "Open up, old lady. We're here to collect." Jack grabbed a wrench from the counter, his hands trembling. Helen stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. "Stay calm," she said. Raymond opened the door just enough to show his face. "You've got the wrong house," he said coolly. One of the bikers sneered. "Oh, we know it's the right house." He swung the bat, smashing the porch light. Raymond didn't flinch. "Leave. Now." Before the bikers could respond, Helen appeared behind Raymond, holding a shotgun. "This is your warning," she said. Her voice was steady, her eyes like steel. The bikers hesitated, their bravado faltering. "We'll be back," one of them growled before retreating to their motorcycles. As they roared off into the night, Helen lowered the shotgun. "This is just the beginning." Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, spreading out the photographs she had taken at the Viper's warehouse. The room was quiet except for the faint tapping of her laptop keys as she cross-referenced names and faces. "These men," she said, pointing to a photo of two bikers outside the warehouse, "aren't just muscle. They're connected to something bigger." Jack leaned over to look. "How do you know?" Emily clicked on a file on her laptop, showing a grainy photo of one of the bikers shaking hands with a man in a suit. "That's Councilman Dyer. He's been linked to several shady deals, and now he's meeting with these guys? It's not a coincidence." Raymond smirked, leaning back against the wall. "Of course it's not. Politicians always keep their hands clean by hiring people like the Vipers to do their dirty work." Helen joined the group, her brow furrowed. "If Dyer's involved, this goes even higher than I thought." Emily nodded. "And if we can link these documents to him, it'll start unraveling the whole network." "But that also makes us bigger targets," Jack said, his voice edged with concern. "If these men are connected to politicians, they'll stop at nothing to shut us up." Raymond crossed his arms. "Let them try. We've got the leverage now. It's all about how we use it." Helen's eyes narrowed. "We don't just use it. We have to make sure the truth comes out in a way that they can't bury it again." Emily looked at the documents on the table. "Then we need to move fast. The longer we sit on this, the more dangerous it gets." Helen nodded, her voice firm. "Then we keep digging, and we prepare for whatever comes next." The house was quiet except for the crackling of the fireplace. Helen sat in her favorite chair, holding a worn photograph in her hands. The edges were frayed, the image faded, but the faces in the picture remained clear. A younger Helen standing beside a man in uniform, their expressions serious. Emily, sitting nearby, noticed the photo. "Who's that?" she asked gently. Helen hesitated, her fingers brushing over the photograph. "That's Robert. He was my commanding officer during the war." Raymond, who had been leaning against the doorway, straightened. "You never talked about him before." Helen let out a long sigh. "There wasn't much to say until now. Robert and I worked on intelligence operations. After the war ended, we stumbled across something we weren't supposed to see, documents tying government officials to illegal arms deals." Emily leaned forward. "The same kind of documents you have now?" Helen nodded. "Robert wanted to expose it immediately. He believed in doing the right thing, no matter the cost. But the cost was high. People we trusted turned on us. They killed him to send a message." Raymond's jaw tightened. "And you? How did you survive?" "I ran," Helen said quietly. "I took the documents and disappeared. Changed my name. Built a new life here, in Plain Rock." Jack, who had just entered the room, stopped in his tracks. "So you've been hiding this for decades, knowing they might come for you?" Hele met his gaze. "I didn't have a choice. If I had destroyed the evidence, it would have been like Robert died for nothing. And now," she held the photograph tighter, "now it's time to finish what we started." The room fell silent. the weight of her words settling on everyone. Raymond stood by the window, staring into the dark yard, his mind racing. The revelation of Helen's past had stirred something in him, a mix of admiration and anger. He'd spent his life believing he was a rebel, the one who broke the rules to survive. Now he wasn't so sure. Jack's voice broke the silence. You realize this isn't just about her anymore, right? If these people find us, they'll take us all down. Raymond turned, his expression hard. You think I don't know that? Jack stepped closer, his frustration boiling over. You've made a career out of skirting the law, and now you want to play the hero? What happens when this goes south? Are you just going to cut your losses and leave us behind? Raymond's fist clenched. I may not live like you, but I don't abandon my family. Emily stepped between them. Enough. Fighting each other isn't going to solve anything. Helen entered the room, her voice calm but firm. She's right. We have to focus. The Vipers won't wait for us to figure out our issues. Jack exhaled sharply, turning away. Fine, but I still don't trust him. Raymond smirked. I don't need your trust, little brother. I just need you to stay out of my way. Helen raised her voice. Enough, both of you. If we're going to survive this, we need to stand together. Otherwise, we've already lost. The tension in the room was thick, but no one argued. Helen's words carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. Now, she continued, we focus on what matters, staying one step ahead of them. For the moment, the fragile truce held. The following afternoon, a sleek black car rolled up Helen's driveway. From the porch, Helen and Raymond watched as a man in a tailored suit stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks before making his way toward the house. That's Councilman Dyer, Raymond muttered, his tone laced with suspicion. Helen nodded, her eyes narrowing. I thought he might show up. Dyer stopped at the base of the porch stairs, offering a thin smile. Mrs. Grayson, I hope I'm not intruding. Helen crossed her arms. You've already intruded by showing up. Dyer chuckled, feigning charm. Straight to the point. I admire that. May I come in? No, Helen's response was firm. Say what you came to say and leave. The councilman's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered. Very well. I'll keep this brief. I represent certain interests that are concerned about some sensitive materials in your possession. Sensitive to whom? Helen shot back. Dyer ignored the jab. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Hand over the documents, and we can ensure everyone involved remains safe. Raymond stepped forward, his expression cold. You're threatening her? On her own property. Dyer raised a hand, feigning innocence. Not a threat, a promise of protection. The people I work with prefer peaceful resolutions. Helen took a step closer to Dyer, her voice low but resolute. Tell the people you work for that I don't scare easily, and I don't negotiate with liars. Dyer's smile faded completely. I hope you reconsider, Mrs. Grayson, for your family's sake. Raymond moved down the steps, standing toe-to-toe with the councilman. Get off this property. Now. Dyer adjusted his tie, turning back toward his car. Good day, Mrs. Grayson. I'll be in touch. As night fell, the Grayson house felt like a fortress under siege. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind seemed to carry the weight of the threats hanging over them. Raymond stood by the window, watching the road for any sign of movement. Helen sat at the dining table, her hands folded, her mind visibly working through every possible scenario. Jack paced back and forth, unable to hide his frustration. This isn't sustainable, Jack said, his voice breaking the silence. We're just sitting here, waiting for them to make the next move. We're not waiting, Raymond replied, not turning from the window. We're watching. There's a difference. Jack threw up his hands. And what happens when they come with more than just words? We can't fight off a gang. Emily, seated with her laptop in the corner, chimed in. He's right. We need a better plan. Something proactive. Helen looked up, her gaze steady. We're not going to start a war, but we're not backing down either. The moment we run, we lose any chance of exposing them. Raymond finally turned, his expression dark. We're dealing with more than just the Vipers. Dyer's visit confirms that this goes higher, way higher. If we're going to stay ahead of them, we need leverage. And how do we get that? Emily asked. Raymond smirked. We bait them. Helen frowned. What do you mean? We leak just enough to rattle their cages, Raymond said. Make them panic. Force them to act recklessly. That's when they'll slip. Jack shook his head. That's insane. You're playing with fire. It's the only way to make them show their hand, Raymond countered. Helen considered his words, the room falling silent. Finally, she nodded. We'll do it, but we do it carefully. No one makes a move without my approval. Raymond smiled faintly. Good. Let's see how they like being on the defensive. The tension in the room remained, but now it carried a sense of purpose. The next morning, Helen sat at the head of the dining table, her eyes moving between Raymond and Emily. The tension between the two was almost tangible, but the stakes left no room for personal conflicts. We need to make them desperate, Raymond began, leaning forward with his hands on the table. If they think they're losing control, they'll make mistakes. Emily frowned. And how exactly do we do that? Leak the documents? That could backfire. They'll come at us harder. Raymond shook his head. Not everything. Just enough to make them think the walls are closing in. A few names, a few details. It'll make them panic. Helen studied her son. And who do you suggest we leak it to? Emily raised her hand. I can get it out there. Quietly through trusted sources. Journalists who know how to handle something like this. Jack, sitting by the window, turned to face them. You're both forgetting one thing. If we start leaking this, we're not just putting ourselves in danger. We're risking the lives of everyone tied to those documents. Helen nodded. Jack's right. We can't be reckless. Raymond smirked. It's not reckless if we control the narrative. We give them just enough to cause chaos, but keep the biggest pieces in our hands. Emily hesitated, but eventually nodded. If we're careful, it could work, but we have to make sure the leaks can't be traced back to us. Helen exhaled deeply, her gaze steady. Then we do it. But remember, this isn't about provoking them. It's about forcing them into the light. Raymond grinned. Don't worry, Mom. I'll make sure they see the spotlight. As the group began preparing the first leak, Helen's resolve hardened. The fight wasn't just about survival. It was about justice. Later that evening, Emily parked her car near an internet cafe in a neighboring town. She'd chosen this location to ensure anonymity while sending the first leak. The cafe's dim lighting and outdated computers gave it an air of forgotten simplicity, which suited her purpose perfectly. She logged into a secure server and began typing the email. The leak was small, just a name and a connection to an off-the-books deal involving Councilman Dyer. Enough to spark interest without revealing the full scope. As she hit send, a prickle of unease crept up her spine. Emily glanced around. The cafe was nearly empty except for an older man at the counter and a couple arguing in the corner. Grabbing her things, she walked quickly to her car. The moment she unlocked the door, she heard the distant rumble of an engine. Turning, she spotted a motorcycle idling at the far end of the parking lot. Her heart raced as the rider leaned forward, clearly watching her. Emily climbed into her car, locking the doors. She started the engine and pulled out of the lot, keeping her eyes on the rearview mirror. The motorcycle followed. Stay calm, she whispered to herself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. She made several turns, weaving through side streets in an attempt to lose her pursuer. When she finally reached the main road leading back to Plain Rock, the motorcycle turned off abruptly, disappearing into a side street. Breathing heavily, Emily pulled over and rested her forehead against the steering wheel. The Vipers knew someone was working against them, and they were watching. Emily straightened, her resolve hardening. She wasn't going to back down now. Helen sat alone on the porch as the first rays of dawn painted the horizon. The weight of decades pressed on her shoulders, but her resolve remained firm. The events of the past few days had made one thing clear. Waiting for the perfect moment wasn't an option anymore. Jack stepped outside, rubbing his eyes. He paused when he saw his grandmother, her posture straight and her expression thoughtful. "You're up early," he said. "I've been thinking," Helen replied, her voice calm. "It's time to act." Jack sat beside her, folding his arms. "You mean the leaks? They're already in motion." Helen shook her head. "Not just the leaks. All of it. The documents, the names, everything needs to see the light." Jack's brows furrowed. "Grandma, if we release all of this at once, they'll come after us harder. We might not survive." Helen turned to him, her sharp eyes meeting his. "If we don't, they'll keep getting away with it. People like Dyer, like Reaper, they count on fear to keep people quiet. I'm done being quiet." Jack exhaled deeply. "And Raymond? What does he think about this?" "He doesn't know yet," Helen admitted, "but he'll support it. He knows this is the only way." Jack hesitated, then nodded. "If you're sure about this, I'll back you up. But we need to have a plan. Something that ensures this information doesn't disappear once it's out there." Helen placed a hand on his arm. "That's why we have Emily. She knows how to get this into the right hands." As the sun rose higher, Helen stood. "We're not running anymore. It's time to end this." Jack watched her, a mix of pride and fear swelling in his chest. The fight ahead would test them all, but Helen's determination gave him strength. Raymond's convoy moved cautiously down the dusty road, 2 SUVs flanking his car. Inside, Helen, Jack, and Emily sat quietly, each lost in their thoughts. The documents were locked in a metal case under Helen's seat. "This route is secure," Raymond said from the driver's seat. "We'll get to the safe house without trouble." Helen didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the passing trees. Something in the pit of her stomach told her it wouldn't be that simple. As the convoy rounded a bend, the sound of engines roared from the surrounding forest. Emily looked up sharply. "What's that?" Raymond cursed under his breath. "Hold on." Out of the trees burst a group of motorcycles, the Vipers. They surrounded the convoy, revving their engines menacingly. One biker pulled alongside Raymond's car, slamming a crowbar against the driver's side window. "Get down!" Raymond barked, jerking the wheel to avoid another biker. Helen reached for the shotgun under the seat. "They're not taking these documents." The SUV behind them skidded to a stop as a biker threw a chain at its tires, flipping the vehicle. Jack turned, his face pale. "We have to keep moving." Raymond swerved, narrowly avoiding a spike strip. "I'm working on it." Helen rolled down her window and aimed. The shotgun's deafening blast sent one of the bikers tumbling to the ground. Emily clutched the seat, her heart pounding. "Get ready to jump," Raymond shouted. "What?" Jack yelled. Raymond pointed to a narrow trail ahead. "It's our only chance. Take the documents and run." Helen nodded grimly. "Do it." As the car slowed, Jack and Emily grabbed the metal case. Together, they bolted into the woods, the chaos of the ambush fading behind them. Jack and Emily ran through the dense forest, the metal case clutched tightly in Jack's hands. The sound of engines and shouting faded behind them, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of leaves underfoot and their labored breathing. They finally stopped in a small clearing, both doubling over to catch their breath. Jack set the case down and leaned against a tree, his chest heaving. "Are they still following us?" Emily asked, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Jack shook his head. "I don't think so." Raymond did his job. He gave us a window to escape. Emily sat down beside the case, running her hands through her hair. "This is insane. We're running through the woods with evidence that could bring down half the state's government, and we don't even know if we'll survive the night." Jack crouched beside her, his tone softening. "We will. Because we have to. Emily looked at him, her brow furrowing. Why is this so personal for you? Jack hesitated, his gaze dropping to the case. It's not just about justice or doing the right thing. This is my family's legacy. My grandma risked everything to protect these documents. My mom sacrificed her marriage, her relationships, all of it to keep me away from this world. If we fail, it means everything they fought for was for nothing. Emily nodded, her expression serious. Then we won't fail. Jack reached for the case. Opening it, he rifled through the papers, pulling out one with a name circled at the top. His face darkened. This is bigger than we thought, he said. Look at this name, Senator Cole. He's one of the most powerful people in the country. Emily's eyes widened. If he's involved, this changes everything. Back at the ambush site, Raymond stood amidst the wreckage, blood dripping from a cut on his forehead. The SUVs were damaged. 2 of his men were injured, and the bikers had retreated. Yet something felt wrong. He scanned the scene, his sharp eyes narrowing as one of his men approached. It was Marcus, a longtime lieutenant in Raymond's organization. "Boss," Marcus said, his voice steady but his expression tense. "You okay?" "I'll live," Raymond replied. "Where's Helen?" "She's with the other team, heading back to the safe house," Marcus said quickly. Raymond frowned. "And the documents?" "They're safe," Marcus said, but his hesitation betrayed him. Raymond stepped closer, his voice lowering. "What are you telling me, Marcus?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Nothing, boss. Everything's under control." Before Raymond could press further, a low rumble of motorcycles echoed in the distance. The Vipers were regrouping. "We don't have time for this," Raymond growled. "Get everyone moving. Now." As the group prepared to leave, Raymond caught Marcus exchanging a glance with one of the other men. His instincts screamed at him. Later that night, as they reached a temporary hideout, Raymond confronted Marcus in private. "Start talking," he said, his tone icy. Marcus raised his hands defensively. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You've been feeding them information," Raymond accused. "That's how they knew where to hit us." Marcus hesitated, and that was all the confirmation Raymond needed. "You sold us out," Raymond said, his voice low and dangerous. "I didn't have a choice," Marcus blurted. "They threatened my family. They said they'd kill them if I didn't cooperate." Raymond stared at him for a long moment before turning away. "You should have come to me." Without another word, he walked out, leaving Marcus to contemplate the weight of his betrayal. Reaper paced a dimly lit warehouse, his frustration radiating off him like heat. His men stood silently around him, their eyes avoiding his. The Vipers had suffered heavy losses during the ambush, and now the patience of their mysterious backers was running thin. The sound of Reaper's boots hitting the concrete echoed in the tense space. He finally stopped, slamming a fist onto the metal table. "I don't care what it takes. We're getting those documents. Do you understand me?" One of the bikers, a wiry man nicknamed Rat, hesitated before speaking. "Boss, they're hitting back harder than we expected. Raymond's not just muscle, he's smart. If we keep pushing, we could lose more than we gain." Reaper's glare was ice cold as he turned to face Rat. "You think I don't know that? You think I care about losses? What I care about is finishing this job before our employers decide we're expendable." The room fell silent. The bikers all knew what was at stake. Crossing their backers was more dangerous than anything they'd faced so far. Reaper picked up a burner phone from the table and dialed a number. After a moment, a deep, steady voice answered on the other end. "Is it done?" the voice asked. "Not yet," Reaper admitted, gripping the phone tightly. "But we're closing in. I need more time." The voice was unimpressed. "You're out of time. If you don't deliver those documents within 48 hours, there won't be a place on this earth where you can hide." The line went dead. Reaper threw the phone across the room, shattering it against the wall. Turning to his men, His voice dropped to a menacing growl. "We hit them tonight. Hard. We take everything they've got. No more warnings." The safe house was eerily quiet, nestled deep in the woods. Helen, Jack, and Emily sat in the living room, the atmosphere heavy with exhaustion. The ambush had shaken them all, but Helen's determination remained unbroken. Raymond entered the room, his face grim. "We've got a problem," he said. Jack frowned. "What now?" "Reaper isn't backing down," Raymond replied. "My sources say they're planning a full assault tonight. They're desperate, and desperate people are dangerous." Emily looked up from her laptop. "We're running out of options. If they attack here, we won't hold them off for long." Helen stood, her expression resolute. "Then we make our stand. We've come too far to run now." Before anyone could respond, the sound of distant engines reached their ears. Jack's eyes widened. "They're already here." Raymond grabbed his gun, barking orders to his men. "Get into position. Protect the documents at all costs." The Vipers descended on the safe house like a storm, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Shots rang out as Raymond's men clashed with the bikers. Helen stayed inside, clutching a folder close to her chest. Suddenly, one of Raymond's men burst into the room, bleeding from a gunshot wound. "They're breaking through," he gasped. Raymond rushed to the front door, his face grim. "Hold the line." Amid the chaos, one of Raymond's closest allies, a loyal enforcer named Gabe, took a fatal shot while protecting the back entrance. His body hit the ground with a sickening thud, his blood pooling on the floor. Raymond knelt beside him, his jaw tightening as he fought back emotion. "Keep fighting," he roared to his men, his voice filled with rage. Inside, Helen whispered a prayer. The fight was far from over. The safe house was in shambles. Broken furniture, bullet holes in the walls, and the acrid smell of smoke filled the air. Helen stood in the center of the living room, her hands trembling as she held the blood-stained folder of documents. Raymond paced furiously near the door, his face a mask of frustration and grief. Jack sat at the table, his head in his hands, while Emily typed furiously on her laptop, trying to send an encrypted message to her contacts. "We can't stay here," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "This place isn't safe anymore." "We're not leaving," Raymond snapped. "If we run, we'll be sitting ducks." Helen stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. Raymond listened to him. "We're outnumbered, and they're getting more desperate. We need to think this through." Raymond stopped pacing and turned to face her. "What's there to think about? We fight back. We take the fight to them." Jack shot out of his chair, his frustration boiling over. "Fight back? Are you insane? Look at what just happened. Gabe is dead, and we're barely holding on." The tension in the room was suffocating. Helen stepped between her son and grandson, her gaze steady. "Both of you stop. This isn't the time to argue." Emily cleared her throat, drawing their attention. "I've contacted a few people I trust. Journalists, lawyers, people who can handle this kind of exposure. But we need time to get the information to them securely." "How much time?" Raymond asked. "A few hours at least," Emily replied. Helen nodded. "Then we hold out for a few more hours. After that, we'll make our move." Raymond scowled but didn't argue. Jack exhaled deeply, his anger dissipating into exhaustion. As the group began preparing for what came next, the faint sound of distant engines echoed in the night. The group moved quickly, fortifying the safe house as best they could. Helen took charge, directing Jack and Raymond to barricade the windows while Emily set up a secure communication line. Every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of the trees outside felt like an impending threat. "They'll come through the front first," Raymond said, loading his pistol. "We need to keep them bottlenecked there." Helen nodded. "Emily, how's the message coming?" "Almost done," Emily replied, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "I'm attaching the key documents to ensure they can't bury this." Jack joined her, his voice low. "Once it's out, will they even care about us?" They'll care, Emily said grimly. But at least the truth will be out there. Suddenly, the roar of motorcycles broke the silence. Lights flickered through the windows as the Vipers surrounded the property. "They're here," Jack whispered, his heart pounding. Reaper's voice boomed from outside. "Grayson, you've got one chance to hand over those documents. Otherwise, we're coming in." Raymond smirked, his grip tightening on his pistol. "Come and get them." The first gunshot shattered the tension, and chaos erupted. The bikers charged the front of the house, firing indiscriminately. Raymond and his men returned fire, holding the line as Helen moved through the chaos, checking on everyone. Jack stayed close to Emily, shielding her as she hit send on the laptop. "It's done," she shouted. Helen's voice rang out over the gunfire. "Hold steady. We just need to buy time." Reaper himself stormed toward the door, his shotgun blasting apart the barricade. Inside, Raymond stood his ground, prepared for the inevitable confrontation. The safe house was under siege, and everyone knew this was their last chance to make it out alive. The safe house was a battlefield. Bullets splintered wood and shattered glass as the Vipers advanced. Raymond barked orders to his men, his voice cutting through the chaos. But it was Helen who commanded the room with an unshakable calm. "Jack, stay with Emily," she shouted over the gunfire. "Raymond, hold the front line." Despite the danger, Helen moved deliberately, her decades of experience as a soldier guiding her every action. She grabbed a rifle from one of Raymond's men, checking its ammunition with practiced efficiency. Raymond ducked behind an overturned table as bullets whizzed past. "Mom, what are you doing?" Helen crouched beside him, her eyes sharp. "What I should have done from the start, leading." Raymond smirked despite the situation. "Didn't think you still had it in you." Helen raised the rifle, firing 3 clean shots through the broken window. The advancing bikers scrambled for cover. "I never lost it." At the back of the house, Jack and Emily worked frantically to protect the laptop. Emily had sent the documents, but the device contained sensitive details they couldn't afford to lose. "Stay low," Jack urged, shielding her as another window shattered. "I'm trying," Emily replied, her hands trembling as she tucked the laptop into a protective bag. Outside, Reaper rallied his men. "Push through. That house doesn't hold forever." Helen heard his voice and motioned to Raymond. "We need to draw him in closer. Isolate him from his men." Raymond nodded. "Leave that to me." With Helen's strategy guiding them, the defenders held their ground. Every move was calculated, every shot deliberate. Helen's presence was a beacon of steadiness amid the chaos. She knew the cost of survival, but she also knew that fear couldn't win. Not tonight. Reaper kicked in the shattered front door, his imposing frame silhouetted against the chaos outside. His shotgun was slung over his shoulder, and his cold eyes swept the room with predatory precision. Raymond stood waiting, his pistol aimed squarely at Reaper's chest. "You made it this far. Let's see if you can finish the job." Reaper smirked, stepping forward without hesitation. "You're a lot of talk, Grayson. Let's see what you've got." The 2 men circled each other like wolves, the tension thick. Helen watched from the corner of the room, her grip tight on her rifle. She wanted to intervene, but knew this was Raymond's fight to finish. Reaper lunged, swinging the butt of his shotgun at Raymond's head. Raymond dodged, delivering a swift punch to Reaper's ribs. The impact barely fazed the biker, who swung again, forcing Raymond to retreat. Outside, the sounds of gunfire were beginning to fade as the Vipers' numbers dwindled. Jack and Emily peeked through the barricaded back window, relief flashing across their faces. "They're retreating," Emily whispered. "Not all of them," Jack replied, glancing toward the front of the house. Inside, Raymond and Reaper's fight raged on. The 2 men exchanged blows, each struggling for dominance. Finally, Reaper managed to knock Raymond's pistol away, leveling his shotgun at him. "Any last words?" Reaper sneered. Before he could pull the trigger, a single gunshot rang out. Reaper staggered, dropping his shotgun as blood blossomed across his chest. Helen stood behind him, her rifle still aimed. "Not in my house," she said, her voice cold and steady. Reaper collapsed, the fight draining from his body. Raymond picked up his pistol, his breathing heavy. "Thanks, Mom." Helen lowered the rifle. "It's not over yet." The room was eerily silent in the wake of Reaper's collapse. Helen stood over his body, her rifle still in hand. Raymond leaned against the wall, his breathing labored, blood trickling from a cut on his temple. Outside, the remaining Vipers began retreating, their motorcycles roaring as they sped away into the night. The relentless gunfire had finally stopped, leaving the house battered but standing. Jack and Emily emerged cautiously from the back room, Emily clutching the bag with the laptop inside. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Not yet," Helen said, her eyes still fixed on Reaper. Suddenly, the sound of a motorcycle engine roared louder. One last biker, a younger member of the gang, burst through the front door with a weapon drawn. Without hesitation, he aimed directly at Helen. Raymond reacted instantly, throwing himself in front of his mother. The shot rang out, and Raymond crumpled to the floor. "Raymond!" Helen screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. Jack lunged at the biker, disarming him with surprising strength. He threw the man to the ground and delivered a punch that left him unconscious. Emily rushed to Helen's side as she cradled Raymond's head. Blood seeped through his shirt, staining Helen's hands. "Raymond," she said, her voice breaking, "stay with me." Raymond coughed weakly, a faint smirk crossing his lips. "Told you I'd protect you, Mom." "Don't talk like that," Helen said firmly, though tears streamed down her face. "You're going to be fine." Emily pressed her hands over the wound, trying to stem the bleeding. "We need to get him out of here. Now." Raymond's breathing grew shallow, his eyes locking onto Helen's. "It's okay. You've got this. I believe in you." Helen clenched her jaw, her heart breaking. "You're not leaving me, Raymond. Not like this." But Raymond's eyes drifted closed, his body falling limp in her arms. The police arrived shortly after the Vipers retreated, their flashing lights illuminating the devastation. Officers swarmed the property, taking the surviving gang members into custody and assessing the damage. Lieutenant Harris, a seasoned officer with graying hair and a weathered face, stepped through the shattered front door. He surveyed the scene, his expression grim. "Looks like hell in here," he muttered. Helen sat on the floor, her hands covered in blood. Jack and Emily stood beside her, their faces pale. Harris crouched in front of Helen, his voice soft but urgent. "Mrs. Grayson, are you okay?" Helen looked up, her expression hollow. "They took everything from me," she said quietly. Harris glanced at Raymond's body, his jaw tightening. "I'm sorry for your loss, but you stopped them. You saved a lot of lives tonight." Jack stepped forward, his voice shaking. "It's not enough. These men weren't just criminals. They were pawns. The people behind them are still out there." Emily held up the bag containing the laptop. "We've sent the documents to trusted sources, journalists, lawyers. They'll expose the truth, but we'll need protection. They won't stop coming for us." Harris nodded. "I'll make sure you're safe. You've done more than anyone could have asked." Outside, officers loaded Reaper's lifeless body onto a stretcher. The Viper's leader was gone, but his final words to Helen still echoed in her mind. "This isn't over." Helen stood slowly, her body aching from exhaustion and grief. She looked at Raymond's still form, her tears falling freely. "You did good, son," she whispered. Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady. "We'll finish this, Grandma. For him. For all of us." Helen nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. The fight wasn't over, but they wouldn't back down. The sun rose over Plain Rock, casting a warm glow over the town that felt eerily at odds with the events of the night before. Helen sat on the porch of the safe house, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She held a steaming cup of tea in her hands, though she hadn't taken a sip. Jack walked outside, his movements slow and tired. He stood next to her, his eyes scanning the yard where officers continued to collect evidence. "The police are almost done," he said softly. "They've arrested every viper they could catch." Helen nodded but didn't speak. Her thoughts were with Raymond, whose body had been taken away hours earlier. Jack hesitated, then knelt beside her chair. "Grandma, I know this is hard, but we did it. The documents are out. The truth is going to come out because of you." Helen finally looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. "Because of us," she corrected. "It took all of us to get here, and we paid a price." Jack nodded, his throat tightening. Raymond knew what he was doing. He'd want us to keep going. Helen reached out, placing a hand on his. "And we will. But it doesn't make the loss any easier." Emily appeared at the doorway, her laptop under her arm. "The first reports are already coming in," she said. "Journalists are publishing the leaks. Dyer's name is everywhere. People are asking questions." Helen straightened in her chair. "Good. Let them ask. And when they find the answers, let them hold those responsible to account." The three of them stood together, the morning light casting long shadows behind them. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had begun to turn. Later that evening, Helen returned to her own house, now eerily quiet after the chaos. She moved slowly through the familiar rooms, her hand brushing over framed photos and mementos of a life lived with resilience and purpose. She stopped in the living room, standing in front of a photo of herself with Raymond and Jack from years ago. It was from one of their rare reunions, a fleeting moment of joy that now felt bittersweet. Sitting in her armchair, Helen opened a small wooden box she kept on a side table. Inside was a stack of letters and photographs, along with a faded medal she'd earned during the war. She held the medal in her hand, its weight grounding her. Raymond's face filled her mind, his laughter, his stubbornness, and the way he'd always pretended not to care even though he cared deeply. She smiled faintly through her tears. The fight had cost her so much, friends, peace, and now, her son. But she knew she couldn't have done anything differently. Her thoughts turned to Jack, whose determination reminded her of herself when she was younger, and Emily, whose courage to expose the truth had reignited Helen's hope for the future. The weight of grief was heavy, but beneath it was a sense of purpose. Helen knew her journey wasn't over, even if this chapter was coming to a close. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Quietly, she whispered, "You didn't die for nothing, Raymond. We'll finish what you started." For the first time in days, Helen allowed herself to close her eyes, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion. But in her dreams, she saw a brighter future, one where the truth had finally prevailed. In the bustling newsroom of a major media outlet, Emily Harper sat at her desk, her fingers flying over the keyboard. The leaks from Helen's documents had sparked a firestorm of media coverage, but Emily's exclusive report promised to be the most comprehensive account of the corruption network's rise and fall. The article opened with a vivid account of the events in Plain Rock, detailing the attack on the Grayson family and the sacrifice that brought the truth to light. Names like Councilman Dyer and Senator Cole were prominently featured, tied to decades of bribery, fraud, and organized crime. Emily glanced at her notes, adding quotes from anonymous sources and excerpts from the leaked documents. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard as she typed the final paragraphs, her mind drifting to Helen, Jack, and Raymond. She'd spent years chasing stories like this, but none had hit so close to home. This wasn't just another scoop, it was a fight for justice. A notification popped up on her screen. Her editor had approved the story for publication. Emily leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. "It's done," she whispered. The next morning, headlines across the country carried her byline. "The Plain Rock Papers, a network of corruption exposed." The article quickly went viral, sparking public outrage and calls for investigations. Emily's phone buzzed with messages from journalists and officials, but one text stood out. It was from Jack. "Thank you for telling the story. Raymond would have been proud." Emily smiled, a mix of relief and pride washing over her. The truth was out, and for the first time, she felt like they'd truly made a difference. In the weeks following the release of the Plain Rock Papers, Jack found himself at the center of a whirlwind. The exposure of the corruption network had led to arrests, resignations, and a flurry of legal activity. Yet, for Jack, the work had only just begun. Sitting in his downtown Dallas office, Jack reviewed a stack of legal files. The phone on his desk rang incessantly, and his inbox overflowed with requests for interviews and consultations. He had become a sought-after figure, a symbol of integrity in the fight against corruption. But his focus wasn't on fame, it was on justice. A knock at the door pulled Jack from his thoughts. A young woman in a suit entered, carrying a tablet. "Mr. Grayson, the team has finished reviewing the files from Senator Cole's office. There's enough evidence to move forward with charges." Jack nodded. "Good. Let's make sure it's airtight before we present it to the DA." The woman hesitated. "There's also been a request from the press for a statement about your family's role in exposing this." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'll address it later. Right now, the focus needs to be on the case." As the assistant left, Jack leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting to his grandmother. Helen's courage had ignited this fight, and Raymond's sacrifice had pushed it over the edge. Jack knew he carried their legacy now. He glanced at a framed photo on his desk. Himself, Helen, and Raymond, taken years ago. It was a reminder of why he was here, of what he was fighting for. Picking up a pen, Jack scribbled a note to himself. "Finish what we started." With renewed determination, he dove back into the files. The battle wasn't over, but Jack was ready for whatever came next. Helen Grayson returned to her small home in Plain Rock under the cover of twilight. The town was still and quiet, the kind of silence she used to cherish but now found unsettling. The scars of the recent battle were still fresh in her mind, but the world outside her door showed no sign of the chaos that had unfolded weeks ago. She paused at the porch, her gaze sweeping over the familiar landscape. The rocking chair she hadn't sat in since that fateful evening was still in its usual spot, untouched by time or tragedy. Inside, the house was just as she had left it. Dust settled on the furniture, and the air carried the faint smell of aged wood. Helen walked to the living room and placed a small box on the table. A collection of Raymond's belongings returned to her by the authorities. She opened the box carefully, pulling out a photograph of Raymond as a boy, grinning widely while holding a baseball glove. Helen sat down, her fingers brushing over the image. "I hope you knew how much you meant to me," she whispered. The sound of footsteps on the porch startled her. She looked up as Jack entered, carrying a bag of groceries. "Thought you might need these," he said, setting the bag on the counter. Helen smiled faintly. "Thank you, Jack. You didn't have to." "I wanted to," Jack replied, sitting across from her. "You doing okay?" Helen nodded slowly. "I will be. It just takes time." Jack placed a hand on hers, his grip warm and reassuring. "We'll get through it. Together." For the first time in days, Helen allowed herself a small, genuine smile. She wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. Helen sat at her dining table late that night, poring over what remained of the documents. Most had been sent to the press or handed over to authorities, but a few pieces still lingered, fragments of a story that hadn't yet been told. One file in particular caught her eye. It was older than the others, yellowed at the edges and tied with a thin ribbon. She untied it, revealing a set of handwritten notes and grainy photographs. One photo made her stomach drop. It showed a group of men at a lavish party, toasting with champagne. Among them was Senator Cole, but another face stood out. A man in a military uniform with a name tag partially visible, Roberts. Helen's heart raced. The name triggered a flood of memories from her time in the military, memories she had long buried. This wasn't just about politicians or businessmen. There was a military connection. As she read further, her suspicions were confirmed. The notes detailed covert operations during her service, operations that had been swept under the rug to protect powerful interests. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Helen stiffened, her hand instinctively reaching for the revolver she now kept nearby. "Who is it?" she called. "It's Emily," came the reply. Helen opened the door, letting the young journalist inside. Emily looked pale, clutching her laptop bag tightly. "We need to talk," Emily said, her voice urgent. "I've been digging through follow-up reports on the leaks. Some of the people implicated, they're disappearing, not just resigning, vanishing." Helen gestured for her to sit, her mind still on the file. "It's not over, is it?" Emily shook her head. "Not even close. And if these new names are right, it's bigger than we thought." Helen sighed deeply, her resolve hardening. "Then we keep going, no matter what it takes." Helen and Emily spent the night combing through the new information. The faint glow of a desk lamp lit the room as pages and photographs were spread across the dining table. "This isn't just a corruption network," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "These people are tied to covert military operations, private defense contracts, and even international dealings. It's a global web." Helen leaned back in her chair, her fingers interlocked as she processed the gravity of the revelations. "This explains why they were so desperate to stop us. It's not just money, it's power. They're playing with lives on a scale we can barely imagine." Emily nodded, scrolling through her laptop. "And they've been doing it for decades, hidden behind layers of shell companies and proxies. These names, Senator Cole, Councilman Dyer, they're just the surface." Helen's expression hardened. "And now we know why the stakes were so high. They couldn't let this come out, no matter the cost." Emily hesitated, then looked at Helen. "If we keep pushing, they'll come after us again. They've already killed to protect their secrets. What's stopping them from doing it again? Hey, le meter gage. Nothing. But that doesn't mean we stop. If we don't expose them, they'll keep getting away with it." Emily sighed. "I'll reach out to my contacts again. We need to release this in a way they can't suppress." Helen stood and placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "You've done so much already. But it's a fight we all have to face together." The weight of the conversation lingered as they worked through the early hours of the morning. Each piece of evidence they uncovered brought them closer to the truth and closer to danger. By dawn, Helen and Emily had compiled everything they'd found into a single damning file. The documents revealed connections between influential figures in government, the military, and major corporations, all working together to exploit resources and people for profit. As they prepared to send the file to a secure contact, a loud knock echoed through the house. Helen's hand instinctively went to the revolver she kept nearby. "Who is it?" she called. "It's Jack," came the familiar voice. Helen relaxed slightly, opening the door to find Jack standing there, his face pale. "Grandma, we have a problem," he said, stepping inside. "What's wrong?" Helen asked, closing the door behind him. Jack pulled out his phone, showing her a news alert. The screen displayed a headline: "Journalist missing after exposing corruption. Foul play suspected." Emily's eyes widened as she leaned over to read it. "That's one of the reporters I worked with on the first leak," she whispered. Helen's jaw tightened. "They're sending a message." Jack nodded. "And it's not subtle. They want you to stop. They're willing to eliminate anyone who threatens them." Emily sat down heavily, her face pale. "What if they find us next?" Helen placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then we're ready for them. But this isn't the time to hesitate. We send the file, and we make sure it's seen by as many people as possible." Jack looked at his grandmother, worry etched across his face. "Are you sure about this? If we do this, there's no turning back." Helen's expression was resolute. "We've come too far to stop now. They wanted to silence us, but we're going to make sure the whole world hears the truth. The small living room of Helen's house had become the command center for their final push. Emily worked furiously on her laptop, encrypting the file for secure distribution. Jack stood by the window, his eyes scanning the quiet street for any signs of trouble. Helen sat at the table, her hands resting on a stack of documents, her expression calm but determined. "This is it," Emily said, breaking the silence. "Once I hit send, it goes to every major outlet, watchdog organization, and independent journalist I know. There's no way they can bury this." Helen nodded. "Make sure it's thorough. If we miss anything, they'll use it to discredit the entire story." Emily glanced at her. "It's all here, names, dates, transactions. Enough to blow this wide open." Jack walked over, his arms crossed. "What about us? When this goes live, they'll know exactly where to look." Helen's gaze didn't waver. "Then we'll face them. But we're not running anymore." Emily's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she took a deep breath. "Here we go." She clicked the send button, and the file began uploading to multiple platforms. Within seconds, confirmations pinged across her screen. The information was out. Helen exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "It's done." But before anyone could relax, Jack's phone buzzed. He answered quickly, his face paling as he listened. "They're coming," he said. Hanging up, a black SUV was spotted heading this way. "It's them." Helen stood, her movements deliberate. "Jack, lock the doors. Emily, get to the back room and stay low. If they want to fight, we'll give them one." The group moved quickly, preparing for what they all knew would be a final confrontation. Outside, the sound of tires crunching on gravel grew louder. The confrontation that followed was swift and brutal. The black SUV screeched to a halt in front of Helen's house, and armed men poured out. Helen, Jack, and Emily held their ground, fighting to protect themselves and the truth they had just unleashed. The chaos finally ended when law enforcement, tipped off by the leaks, arrived in force. Helicopters roared overhead as officers stormed the scene, arresting the remaining attackers. The last remnants of the network had been exposed, and its power was crumbling. Helen stood on her porch as the dust settled, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion, but her eyes alight with determination. Jack stood beside her, his arm wrapped in a hastily applied bandage, while Emily clutched her laptop to her chest. "It's over," Jack said softly. "For now," Helen replied. "But the fight for justice doesn't end with us." The next morning, news outlets around the globe carried the story of the Plain Rock Papers. Images of powerful figures being led away in handcuffs dominated headlines. Public outrage surged, and demands for accountability grew louder. Helen sat on her porch, watching the sunrise. For the first time in years, the town felt peaceful. Emily joined her, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You did it," Emily said, handing Helen a mug. "We all did," Helen corrected, taking a sip. "Raymond, Jack, you. Everyone who stood up when it mattered." Jack stepped out onto the porch, a faint smile on his face. "What now, Grandma?" Helen looked out at the horizon, the warm glow of the morning sun casting long shadows over the quiet town. "Now we live, and we make sure they never forget what happened here." The 3 of them sat together, the weight of the past still present but overshadowed by the promise of a brighter future. Enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Share your thoughts in the comments and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next thrilling episode. See you in our next video. Take care